This video will be part one of my coverage of social cognitive theory and cognitive therapy for PSY 230 personality theory. The majority of the chapter does focus on Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory, but we are also going to consider Aaron Beck's work in the development of cognitive therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. So we'll start with Albert Bandura, who, along with B.F. Skinner, is probably one of the most well-known psychologists who originated work in North America. Bandura was born in Canada, educated both in Canada and in the United States. He was a graduate student in Iowa, and at the time he was a graduate student, behaviorism and learning theory were all the rage at large land-grant universities like the University of Iowa, at the University of Nebraska, Ohio State. Big schools tended to have programs that were focusing their attention on behaviorism and kind of the solidification of psychology as a science. Bandura also, though, was interested in mental health and the treatment of mental health conditions. So his training was primarily in clinical psychology, but he never really lost his interest in research and the development of theory for a more complete understanding of how people become who they are. He was interested in a wide range of topics that made connections between cognition, emotion, and behavior. So while he was strictly trained in behaviorism, he felt it was limiting. And given his training further in clinical psychology, he really sought to meld the two, the basic knowledge of learning theory, but then also its practical applications in the wider world. He's best known for his theories of social learning, but also in his study of more complex human experiences such as motivation and the experience of self-efficacy. So, he was looking at these, not just the observable, but also what was under the surface. So if you remember with B.F. Skinner, he was like, don't bother studying anything under the surface. It's not relevant. You can't see it. You can't observe it. Therefore, don't study it. Only study behavior and its antecedents and its consequences. Bandura had some fundamental disagreements with that perspective. He believed that you really do need to look under the hood. You have to think about emotion. You have to think about cognition, and you have to think about motivation. Like Skinner, like Maslow and Rogers, he was elected as president of the APA, so he had his finger on the pulse of the wider national discussion of psychology. He was also a recipient of a Distinguished Science Contribution Award in 1980 and was honored by President Obama, as you see in the photo here, for his contributions to the science of human psychology. So what are the basic theoretical premises of social cognitive theory? And I will note, it's been called other things, like social learning theory. I think your authors are choosing to emphasize the cognitive component because it is so distinguishing when you're making comparisons between Skinner's approach in radical behaviorism and the approaches of later behavioral theorists who were incorporating cognitive, emotional, and motivational components to their theories. So first, there's an assumption that we have as humans, and the we here is human beings. We have a powerful cognitive system. We have this great big brain with this great big frontal lobe. We have language capacities. So we have a powerful mental system that allows us to construct observations of our own behaviors, to think about them, and to talk about them. We also have the capacity to use that evaluative capacity and observation to understand our own emotional states. So when we talk about powerful cognitive or symbolizing capacities, we're talking about the capacity to observe our own behavior, to think about our own mental states as we move through our social world. And that social world is critical. So the second basic premise is that the things that happen in the environment interact with internal things like thoughts, feelings, and our biological state in a reciprocal fashion. So our behavior is a consequence and a cause within that interaction between our inner states, cognition, emotion, our biological state, and that interacts with the environment itself and what's going on in it. He assumed, like other social cognitive theorists who would follow him, that the self, that inner life that we define as self, and our broader complex system of personality traits are embedded in our social environment. So we think about ourselves, we make perceptions of our own behaviors, we construct perceptions of other people's patterns of behaviors, and that creates this complex network of beliefs and understandings of how the world works. He also argued, like many social cognitive theorists that came after him, that we engage in what he called self-regulation, meaning we can, since we are capable cognitively of projecting out into the future and reflecting backward in time, since we're capable of observing other people's experiences and noting what happens to them as a result of their behaviors, we can plan. And by planning, we select goals, we decide how to pursue those goals, we think about what are the consequences of choices that I make here, choices that I make there, as a way of regulating our own behavior in pursuit of those goals. Now, notice the distinction here between what Skinner argued, that we shouldn't be studying any of these internals, things like self-regulation, things like emotion, metacognition, which is thinking about your own thinking. He took those off the table. Bandura put them back on the table. Bandura argued something called reciprocal determinism, meaning that there's a complicated, although, when you really think about your own behavior, it makes complete sense. There's an interaction between behavior, internal dynamics, which means your thoughts, your emotions, your motivations, and external factors. So what you do is a product of your personal factors, emotions, cognitions, motivations, your environment, what kind of antecedents and reinforcers does it offer, what kind of observation models does it offer, that predicts your behavior. Your previous behavior also predicts who you are, your emotions, your motivations, your cognitions. It also has an impact on the environment. How you behave shapes the environment. The environment has, and personal factors and behavioral factors all have this reciprocal interaction with one another. So he used this phrase, reciprocal determinism, to describe how behavior impacts how we think, and how we think impacts how we understand the social and physical environment. The social environment impacts how we think and what we believe, and it affects our behaviors, and so on and so on. Triadic reciprocality, and that's, triadic referring to the three components, behavior, environment, and internal factors. They are reciprocal with one another, and Bandura identified those as the three critical components. So one assumption is that behavior can shape cognition, awareness, emotion, motivation. So what you are doing right now, for example, if you are engaging in, say, friendly behavior with someone, you can then infer from your own behavior that you are a friendly person, that becomes a part of your structure of awareness of who you are, and it becomes a part of your a sense of self. If you see yourself being very competent at a specific behavior, you can define cognitions of self-efficacy in that area. You become more motivated to engage in that behavior in the future, and so on. So what we do and the consequences of our behaviors tends to affect our cognition, our emotion, and our motivational states. A second assumption is that internal factors are also shaped by the environment. So if your environment gives you certain kinds of opportunities but doesn't give you certain other kinds of opportunities, that's going to impact how you see yourself, how you feel about yourself, how you see the environment, how you feel about the environment, and what you're motivated to do within that environment. Internal events, thoughts, feelings in the moment have an impact on both situations and or on both behaviors that you may choose to engage in and the environment that surrounds you. So for example, if you are very fearful in any given moment, that's going to shape what you choose to do and how you interact with the environment, and that may have an impact on the environment itself. So think about the fears, the anxieties that we've all had over the last 2 years about the pandemic, and think about how that influences how you think and feel about your friends and neighbors, how you think about your workplace, how you think about going to class, going to the grocery store. Internal events like being anxious or fearful, or being angry for that matter, influence what you choose to do. Like, am I going to wear a mask? Am I going to have my groceries delivered? Am I going to stay home more often? Am I going to do other things that restrict my behavior? If I'm not feeling particularly fearful, I may not wear a mask. I may continue to go about my usual activities without restrictions. So your internal thoughts and feelings influence what you choose to do. That also has an impact on the environment itself. So if a large proportion of the public is feeling very fearful and is wearing masks and is not wanting to go to the grocery store, the stores are going to start offering curbside pickup. They may offer delivery services in response to the fearful thoughts that are being experienced by the public. If there's a high degree of anger and resistance, those same businesses, the environment, may offer different options for different people feeling different things, right? So they interact. Our beliefs about our own behaviors will also impact the likelihood of our success. So if you think you're going to do well in a particular task, you're more likely to actually succeed. If you feel like there's a risk of failure, if you feel less in control of a certain task, that makes it more likely that you will fail. So what he's talking about there essentially is self-efficacy, and we'll come back to that concept later in this chapter. So to review, reciprocal determinism and triadic reciprocality, whichever term you want to use, or you could combine all three, triadic reciprocal determinism. Basically, reciprocal determinism means that the factors affect each other and determine what patterns of behavior will come to characterize your personality. The personal cognitive factors, or internal factors as they were referred to earlier, these are beliefs, expectations, your temperament, and your assumptions about self-efficacy in different domains. The behavioral factors are what are you doing right now that you are capable of observing in yourself. And then finally, the environmental factors, the literal physical surroundings, things that are around you right now, and the potential for you to be rewarded or reinforced for what you're actually doing. Now, you're probably most familiar with Albert Bandura's studies in observational learning. Particularly, you may remember something called the Bobo doll study, where Bandura studied the emergence of aggressive behaviors and the acquisition of aggressive scripts in children who were exposed to a model, an adult model, who behaved aggressively toward a blow-up clown doll that you could punch in the nose and it would come right back because it was weighted at the bottom. So you probably remember that from an introductory psychology class, or if you've had a social psychology class, you've probably watched videos of it. His research was really in the direction of showing that, unlike Skinner, who argued that you really need to stop studying internal states. You can't make assumptions about them, and they're not necessary. He argued, yeah, motivation happens, thinking happens, expectations happen, and also internal things like genetics and evolution happen. However, they are not necessary for explaining the likelihood or the reduced likelihood of a given behavior. Bandura disagreed. So Skinner, in Skinnerian theory, the behavior has to happen, then it has to be reinforced for it to increase in likelihood. Bandura was like, I've watched children. They learn stuff without reinforcement. They pick it up. So he believed that learning doesn't depend strictly on direct personal experience with reinforcements. So in contrast, Bandura argued that significant learning happens just through watching. And this happens not just in humans, it happens in other species as well, particularly in highly social species that interact with one another. So in the same way that little kids, when they're watching their favorite cartoons, learn to play out scripts that include a wide range of types of behaviors, and they do so readily. We also see this in primates. We see it in everything. It's been clearly demonstrated in lots and lots of species, and not just the brightest of species. In many other social species, including some insects, it's been demonstrated that simply watching the behaviors of others of your group, whether they are reinforced or punished, that knowledge can be acquired, and then it shapes the behavior of the observer. So basically, observational learning is what it sounds like. It's based on the assumption that learning doesn't have to involve reinforcement on the part of the learner. For many species, it is evolutionarily engineered into that species that you learn to observe, and you observe what happens to others. And that can give you kind of a leg up in terms of knowing what to do in a given environment. So many species, and for many, this is evolutionarily predicted by the fact that they are species where the individuals depend on each other for their success. They learn to observe the others. It's like a shortcut to knowing how to keep yourself safe, how to get yourself fed, how to be successful in the dating market. We learn by observation. Bandura argued that it's simply enough to watch. And if you've spent any time around small children, you know they are sponges. They acquire patterns of behavior just by watching what happens. In observations, what's happening, and based on observational learning theory, the person or organism, whether it's human or not human, associates stimuli with one another. So these are called SS, stimulus laws of behavior. And this is not Bandura's original idea. There were already basic learning theories about SS connections. So in classical conditioning, you're learning to connect previously disconnected stimuli with one another, such as bell and the smell of food. He argues that having one organism simply watch another organism experiencing the SS connection, the stimulus-stimulus connection, is enough to allow for learning to occur. And this has actually been demonstrated in dogs. If you go back to the basic Pavlovian setup, where you have a dog repeatedly exposed to the connection between a bell and the presentation of food, over time the bell is capable of eliciting a conditioned response in the dog alone without the presence of the food. When dogs were exposed to another dog being classically conditioned in that manner, that watching dog, that observing dog that was never presented with food, also starts to salivate at the sound of the bell. So observation alone is enough to establish SS connections. It's also in the context of operant conditioning. If an organism watches another of its kind, or even across species, this can happen. It can happen in cross-species interactions with certain kinds of organisms. If you observe a model getting either positive or negative reinforcement or getting punished for a particular response, the observer will learn what those consequences were and will modify its own behaviors in response to that. So, one child may observe another child who gets punished for yelling in class. That child may reduce the likelihood of their willingness to yell in class. Or if a child sees that that another student who raises his or her hand in class gets a smile from the teacher, they too may want to raise their hand and get that smile in exchange. So when we think about observational learning, Bandura is acknowledging that both classical and operant conditioning happen, that they are important parts of the learning process, but he gave a lot less attention to it for humans and other primates. He studied exclusively humans. He didn't study animals in the laboratory in his own career. He certainly did when he was a graduate student, but beyond that, he moved forward and studied humans. He felt that it was much more significant for humans to study by observation or to learn by observation because it's more efficient. And it brings into the theory the social interactions that are so essential to human experience. He argued that people grow by becoming more and more autonomous from the reinforcements that are given to them by others. So instead of needing, for every incremental change in behavior, instead of needing direct experience with reinforcements and punishers, people start to step back from that and regulate their own behavior. Now, this self-regulation is certainly possible in many, many species. We see it, good trainers of animals seek to what's called shape and fade. They shape a behavior through active reinforcements, and then they fade those reinforcers out so the behavior becomes more self-sustaining. Bandura argues that people, by being able to use more complicated forms of observational learning, and by being very attentive to information in the environment about reinforcers and punishers, can learn without that direct experience at all. He argues that this increases their capacity for self-reinforcement and the exercise of self-control. Finally, having this kind of self-control impacts the environment. Basically, people set up their environments so that they receive more reinforcers, fewer punishers. So they create their own environments, their environments shape them, and so on. Back to that triadic reciprocality model. In his research, and sorry for the image, one of my kids, when she was growing up, was really into Junie B. Jones books. And one of them, Monkey See, Monkey Do, was one of her favorites. Anyway, what are some of the factors that influence observational learning through modeling? what Bandura was able to demonstrate was that people, even very small children, pay attention to the characteristics of the models they are following. So we tend to look for similarities. Bandura was able to demonstrate in terms of modeling, say, aggressive behavior or pro-social behavior. Kids tend to be more responsive to models that look like them, and so they learn more quickly from models who are similar to them than models who are significantly different. It's not that they can't learn from a model that is different, it's that the learning is more efficient. It's quicker when the model is similar. The more dissimilar the model, the less efficient the learning. Also, aspects of the observer interact here. When an observer is confident, has high self-esteem, they tend to direct their own behavior more readily, whereas those who lack confidence and are lower in self-esteem tend to imitate more readily. So there are those inner kind of variables. When you have, say, kids who, or adults, it doesn't matter. If you have someone who scores low in self-efficacy, meaning they don't feel confident that they can enact change in their environment or that they will be successful on various tasks, or perhaps that they don't feel all that great about themselves, they may look to others more immediately to shape their behavior because they don't feel confident that they know what to do next. In comparison, people who have high confidence, who really think they can control their own behavior and can bring about good outcomes, they tend to direct their own behavior more often. They also pay attention very, very much to the consequences of behaviors. Even very little kids, toddlers, can note when, say, an older sibling gets punished or gets a reinforcer, a positive reinforcer for a particular behavior, and they will come to imitate that act pretty quickly. We appear to have evolved that capacity since it tends to jump out really, really early in kids, that they will watch what's happening and they will engage in that behavior as a result. That concludes part one of my coverage of Bandura and Beck, social cognitive theory and cognitive therapy.